I'd like to start with saying that this is a very simple story about a painting and its repaint, as it were, and a lot of what I'm going to be showing you has actually points have been made before, but anyhow, let's take a closer look at what happened to these pictures after they were made. The talk centres on this image. It's from Westminster Abbey. It's obviously of Elizabeth I, or maybe not so obvious. It's been in the collection there since the 18th century, and this is an early 20th century picture of the portrait in the deanery. It's still in this frame, which is obviously much later. It's Victorian. The portrait is clearly identifiable as Elizabeth by an inscription in the upper left-hand corner, and the date of the painting is given twice in this inscription. Once as the 37th year of her reign, which began on Accession Day, 17th of November 1594, and then once more in a rather complicated chronogram as a sort of hidden date within the writing of the inscription. And with a little bit of knowledge of trickery in these Tudor Sauerbergs, it can add up to 1594. In other words, when the Queen was in her 60s. Nevertheless, the portrait now depicts a woman half that age, not a facelift and Botox later. One would have expected her perhaps to look more like this, and this is, of course, the very famous Isaac Oliver miniature from the V&A. This extraordinary miniature has a reputation of being one of very few that the Queen actually sat for. It dates from 1592. It's unfinished and shows the aging Queen, quite possibly with a few teeth already missing. Oliver's account does accord well with descriptions of the Queen's appearance in the late 1590s, and I have included a couple of these primary source fragments that relates to how she looked in the 1590s. One is from André Huot, the Morceau de Mas, and it dates from December 1597, and the other one is by Paul Henschner, who describes the Queen in Greenwich in 1598. Both of them obviously do point out the very bad teeth that the Queen had. Apparently, Paul Henschner puts it down to the fountains with sugar that the English exported. Well, but back to Westminster. In raking on specular light, a ghostly image of a much older Queen is visible, and I hope you can make out the furrows on her forehead and the wrinkles around her mouth, and particularly the much narrower cheekline on the left-hand side. And of course, if we take a look at an X-ray, this is before treatment, all is revealed. The presence of this older Queen has been suggested since at least the late 19th century, and indeed it was confirmed in 1952 when an X-ray of the face was taken by Ian Rawlins, that's the first scientific advisor to the National Gallery, took an X-ray just of the face. The X-ray was taken during a treatment by Mr. Wallace of Holder & Sons, and suitably it was set in motion just weeks after the succession of Elizabeth II. If one looks at the face only, a number of changes are evident, not only in age and body mass, but also the jewellery closest to her face has been altered. The 5-row pearl choker with a very large pendant has been reduced to just a single strand of spherical pearls, and the large teardrop pearl earring has been moved slightly forward and reduced in size. However, on your left-hand side, you can perhaps just see the bigger original pearl just behind the newer one. The X-ray, of course, tells us a great deal about the survival of the earlier face, but it can never really inform us about the finer aspects of the flesh, as the graces and transitions are simply not visible in an X-ray. So one has to be very cautious when talking about the condition of the earlier face. Nevertheless, there does seem to be a discrepancy between the quality of the original and the more formulaic overpaint, if only to judge by the detailing of the costume. The Queen's hands were also plumbed up in this campaign, and I'll show you details of this later. But the rest of the painting has not really been touched. The touching is very much confined to joints and edges, and I would say that this is actually a painting in rather good condition, and in places quite excellent. condition. Generally, the painting technique of the original can be characterized by a very skilled, well-rehearsed and very systematic approach throughout, each layer from the preparatory ones to the finishing touches playing a part in the final effect. And I'd like to draw your attention here just to the final addition of the gold and silver threads, so the exquisite jewellery. We've seen very comparable details already over the past few days. The paint handling is superb, and the economy applied is considerable, as exemplified, for example, by the two concentric circles of ostrich feathers in the fan, as seen on this IR. And I've marked the centre of the compass that the circle sets on the top right-hand side there. There's not a brushstroke too few or too many. It's a painting of good quality, displaying many hallmarks of the late 16th century Anglo-Netherlandish tradition, of which we have seen so many beautiful images over the past few days. All layers extend right to the edge, but there's no sign of the size of the painting ever having been altered. And now, this is almost self-explanatory. 3 vertical board joins, the centre board slightly wider, a configuration that again avoids a joint down the face of the sitter. Dendrochronological examination by guess who revealed that all 3 boards originate from the same tree, which grew in the eastern Baltic. The latest ring was made in 1586, making the first probable date of the use of the panel in the mid-1590s. So it could just have been made within that 37th year of Elizabeth's reign, but not necessarily. And I put up the dates of use for the panel that Ian suggested, 1594 to 1626. This is another version of the same painting. It belongs to the collection of the Duke of Buccleuch and hangs in the Great Hall at Boughton House. And I should point out that the Boughton version is on canvas and not on panel. Interestingly, it shares the same inscription in the upper left-hand corner, including that lower sentence, which may be later a later addition. The Boughton version is perhaps a little hopefully attributed to Marcus Verratz, and thus ultimate with portraits like these, including the Ditchley portrait. And I'm only showing these to perhaps make the point that no firm attribution of the Westminster portrait is possible because of that lack of the stylistically most important part of the painting, the face. The relationship between the 2 paintings is not clear at present, but evidently they're very close in scale and detail, and an overlay of significant tracings of significant elements such as the face and the precision of hands makes it clear that they could have been made by the same pattern, or the same pattern could have been used. But dare I say that the Boughton version does appear slightly more laboriously worked, not least the handling of the metalwork in the fan. The Westminster having of course been overpainted, and here I draw your eye to the ring, the pearl that is visible on the Boughton version between the ring and the little finger. If you look at that, you can see just how much the hands have been plumbed up in the Westminster version. Since all the comparative details from the costume seem to indicate that the Westminster portrait is as high, if not higher, than that of the Boughton version, I feel quite comfortable with the notion that the difference in quality also probably is extended to the face, and that might be difficult to see in the slide. Many others have also suggested, or other people have suggested, the Westminster portrait to be the prime version, although almost as many have dismissed it outright as 18th century prestige because of the repainted face. But let's look at the overpaint. The key to when it was overpainted is in this 3rd version of the same painting, and it's recorded at King's School in Gloucester, formerly the Bishop's Palace there, and sadly the present whereabouts of the portraits are unknown. But as you can see from this early photograph, it's certainly a copy of the repainted Westminster portrait. That was commissioned by Martin Benson, who was the Bishop of Gloucester between 1735 and 52. And as the Bishop of Gloucester, he was the successor of a certain Joseph Wilcox, who became the Dean of Westminster in 1731. As mentioned, and as according to an inscription on the reverse of the Westminster portrait, it was this Dean Wilcox who donated the portrait to the deanery, possibly in connection with his move there. And as we have seen, it would seem that the portrait was already overpainted by the time it was copied. That means that it would have been revamped a generation or two before, so late 17th or early 18th century. So returning just briefly to why it might have been overpainted, perhaps it was just too visually unappealing. Actually, the Barton website themselves suggest that this might be the source of the portraits that were ordered to be defaced by the Privy Council in 1596. So I think if nothing else, it shows that they don't themselves find this the Barton version to be a flattering image. So, but if we talk about the repainting in more general terms, there can be little doubt that it was at least in part repainted because the portrait, as the type, was outdated. But blaming it solely on updating, I think, is perhaps a little simplistic. It's interesting to speculate why it was updated rather than just replaced or chopped down. Elizabeth's image, or in Elizabeth's image, the costume does seem to some extent to work as much as a regalia as the face, conceivably an indication of some resonance that her portrait had from a relatively early date, apart from the people who actually wrote them. So, it has been suggested that the portrait was screwed up in 1760 in connection with the bicentenary of the foundation of the Collegiate Church of St. Peter, Westminster, that's also known as Westminster Abbey. Elizabeth's funeral effigy was redone at this occasion, and sadly there's nothing left of the original effigy, although it is believed that the present face, which does date from 1760, is a copy of the original face by John Court, if not that of the 1606 tomb effigy by another Court, Maximilian, allegedly assisted by John de Critz. And I think with the Gloucester version, we can safely dismiss this. It seems that the 1760 occasion was more occupied with the likeness of Elizabeth in old age. Undeniably, the Westminster portrait sits quite comfortably with court portraiture of the late 17th and early 18th century. Updating the head and hands would have brought the portrait much more in line with contemporary notions of courtly taste. In many ways it sits. This is a generic yet fashionable late Stuart or early Hanoverian face. Changing of the jewellery is a very subtle but effective way of producing a more restrained, classic-looking beauty. It's interesting to speculate that it could have taken place, the repainting, under Queen Anne. I don't know. I'm very sorry about this. It should have been an image of the whole effigy of her. I don't know why that decided to get bigger. She was the first sole female ruler since Elizabeth, and she consciously identified herself with a strong existing iconography. She used the same emblems of power and deliberately imitated Elizabeth's coronation robes at her own coronation and adapted the same personal motto. While the Westminster case might be a sort of neat cartoon-like case study, it's not an isolated incident. There are dozens and dozens of questionable Elizabeths out there waiting to be extolled. And I think their sheer number do reinforce our understanding of the scale of production in some way, even if some of these are later prestigious, probably. The photo archives are simply full of them, and in the Heinz archive alone, there's whole books dedicated to these dubious, potential, probable, hopeful, maybe Elizabeths. And of course, one cannot just proclaim that there might be Tudor portraits underneath these curious and anachronistic-looking queens just by looking at a painting, let alone a photograph. Naturally, each case would have to be verified or disproven through thorough technical examination. Nevertheless, casting our eye over a collection like this, a few comments may be made. Some have clearly had several campaigns of restoration, each with ever-expanding retouching, thereby moving into the realms of repainting. Others may well be mistaken identities, later copies, or pastiches. A number of these curious Elizabeths are in smaller collections, many of them abroad, A lot of them are in private hands, and another number of them have gone through the art market. So a concerted effort of actually looking at these Elizabeths from a technical point of view is rather difficult. At first glance, a lot of these are not top drawer portraits, and some of them are known to be extensively overpainted and have a very complicated history of overpaint that are quite difficult to disentangle. And now here, I'm very grateful to Tanya for this. When she herself looked at the National Portrait Gallery collection, she was soon rewarded with one of these curious Elizabeths, which seems to have been revamped in later centuries. And Libby Sheldon did some cross-section and could soon prove that this also was an overpainted portrait. The lower layers have been wholesale repainted, and in that lower left-hand cross-section, maybe you can see that the top layer actually reads in Libby's handwriting, modern spray paint. And underneath this, there is an earlier scheme, probably an 18th century repaint, but that covers an even earlier scheme, possibly a Tudor. It's very easy to blame the restorer that has gone before, and many have done so. And recently, the Westminster portrait was described as deceptive and as untrue. And of course, it's tempting to reveal an earlier portrait, even if, in this case, the debate was in no way informed by financial considerations, since the painting will never leave the collection. But there is a frustrating disconnect between the style of the face and the costume, even a sense of misrepresentation, which I think perhaps we can all relate to. These are portraits that we normally just dismiss, but are we missing a point here? They do raise additional questions, intriguing questions, concerning the longevity of portraits of the Virgin Queen and the changes in which her image must have functioned within the visual culture of later centuries. It points straight to that very complex relationship between portrait and iconic image. And in many of the art-looking Elizabeths I've shown you, that it really, the portrait element is all but gone, I would say. So, anyhow, I cannot resist showing you this case of the portrait of Henry, Prince of Wales on horseback by Robert Peake from Parham Park, which you also saw yesterday. Before on your left and after restoration on your right. This does seem a very good illustration of a portrait type that somehow quickly went out of fashion. Not many generations after its completion, it was updated in a more Van Dyckian style less than before restoration. It seems clear that the particular conventions of Tudor portraiture, at least in certain parts, rapidly became unfashionable when set against the dashing elegance of Van Dyck, the Van Dyckian court style. And it's a sledgehammer argument again, but in one lifetime you could be portrayed in these two ways. Obviously Charles is first, and there's only 20 years between the two portrait types. Inevitably, the repaint as found in the Westminster portrait has a direct impact about decisions about treatment. And I'm so sorry, again. And this is a before treatment image here. In essence, it is, as always, discussions about ethics versus aesthetics, and a perpetual crossfire of the painting conservator, quite apart from any technical difficulty removing such early overpaint might bring, or indeed what may or may not be found underneath. It may be possible but not desirable, or indeed desirable but not possible to uncover an earlier face. It's a very familiar situation to all conservators. It's a place we know well, I think, the considerations we do. In this particular case, it was decided to keep the historic face, but only after much debate. And this is what she looked like after treatment. Interestingly, in this connection, the same conclusion about treatment was reached in 1952 at the NPG. Mr. Adams at the NPG put it in a letter to Dean Alan Don, agreeing with Mr. Wallace, his conservator, that if cleaned, he would only be left with the wreck of a picture. And again, many people to thank, and thank you.